Hello and welcome back. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look now at our headlines. Israel's defense minister has approved a planned military expansion into Gaza City, calling up 60,000 reservists as explosions are reported in Gaza's Khan Yunis. Meanwhile, a diplomatic spat between Israel and Australia over the recognition of a Palestinian state has intensified. Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar is in Moscow and will meet Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and First Deputy Prime Minister Denis Manturov. His visit comes days after President Putin briefed Prime Minister Narendra Modi on his Alaska meeting with President Trump over the Russia-Ukraine war. Donald Trump has acknowledged that there is a possibility that Russian President Vladimir Putin doesn't want to deal with Ukraine. Meanwhile, Trump rules out US troops being deployed to Ukraine, but eyes aerial support for security as the US and European military planners begin exploring post-conflict security guarantees for Zelensky. This comes as a reported Ukrainian drone attack late on Tuesday night knocked out power plants in parts of Russia's held Zaporizhzhia region. This comes as Ukraine says Russian strikes on an energy facility in the Odessa region have sparked fires. India and China have agreed to resume direct flights and boost trade and investment as they rebuild ties damaged by the 2020 border clashes. The deal includes reopening broader trade points and easing visa rules, India's foreign ministry has confirmed. The US State Department has revoked over 6,000 international student visas, citing violations such as assault, DUI, burglary, overstays, and what they've termed as support for terrorism. Officials did not clarify the latter, but noted that some students protesting in support of Palestine had been targeted. North Korea's Kim Yo-jong has accused South Korean President Lee Jae-myung of a dual personality for seeking peace while holding joint drills with the US. The exercises test an upgraded response to North Korean nuclear threats. And Syrian Foreign Minister Assad al-Shabani has met an Israeli delegation in Paris to discuss regional stability. The US-mediated talks focused on de-escalation in southern Syria and non-interference in Syria's domestic affairs. But we start this hour as India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar has landed in Moscow for a crucial three-day visit. Jaishankar will hold high-level talks with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and First Deputy Prime Minister Denis Manturov. He's also set to co-chair the 26th session of the Intergovernmental Commission Trade and Economic Cooperation and address the India-Russia Business Forum. This diplomatic engagement comes just days after two phone calls between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Russian President Vladimir Putin, their latest following Putin's meeting with US President Donald Trump in Alaska, where the ongoing Ukraine conflict was a key topic. The visit also follows a sharp escalation in US-India trade tensions, with Washington slapping 25% tariffs on Indian imports over New Delhi's continued purchase of Russian oil. Well, joining us to discuss the significance of this meeting and, of course, all of the topics that surround it, Dmitry Semez Jr., the head of Sputnik India, joining us live. Thank you ever so much, Dmitry, for taking the time to speak with us. Let's look at the significance of this meeting. Firstly, I detailed all of the talks that are set to take place. What do you expect to be the outcome of these bilateral talks?
Well, look, it's clear that this visit will have a business, trade, heavy agenda. Even if we look at the fact at who sent the invitation, Russian Deputy Prime Minister Denis Manturov. Manturov has, for the better part of the last decade, been basically the Russian government's top guy when it's come to trade and industry. And, you know, as you mentioned, there's also going to be the meeting of the Intergovernmental Commission on Trade. Dr. Jaishankar will be addressing the India-Russia Business Council. And I think that it's important to look at this because we've become accustomed to looking at Russia-India trade primarily through the context of weapons sales and more recently oil sales. But what we're seeing slowly but surely is ramping up of industrial cooperation, where, for example, the best known example of this is BrahMos, where you have Russian engineers and Indian engineers working together to produce a world-class supersonic missile. But this is starting to branch out in other areas like, machinery, like trains, like pharmaceuticals. So I think that on the top of the agenda is how we can increase this bilateral industrial cooperation. And obviously the second thing is a long-standing question, long-standing topic in Russia-India cooperation is how do we, manage some of the logistical issues? Because again, unlike China, there is quite a bit of geographic distance between Russia and India. So thinking of what are the most efficient but secure trade routes is definitely going to be on the top of the agenda, especially given the fact that, Iran, which is at the centerpiece of the international north-south transport corridor, has faced some geopolitical tension in recent years. I think that's going to be an important topic. And of course, easing ruble to rupee trade, because as you mentioned, these talks are taking amid growing threats from the White House, growing threats from the United States.
Yes.
And accordingly, both Russia and India have an urgent need to think about how to make their cooperation even more sanctions-proof than it currently is.
Absolutely, Dmitry. Let's build on that because, of course, we know that the 50% tariffs are set to be imposed on the 27th of August. Half of those tariff rates are coming because of India's purchase of Russian oil. Donald Trump so far only placing sanctions on India for purchasing Russian oil. And we heard from the White House overnight, they said that this was to end the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Diplomacy is still ongoing, but how significant are these tariffs and how will discussions over the next couple of days with Jaishankar and his counterpart Lavrov and other diplomats potentially shape future relations, not just with Russia and India relating to trade, but also potentially India-US relations amidst this uncertainty over tariff action?
From Russia's perspective, these tariffs are not about India's purchase of Russian oil, because as the Indian government itself pointed out, the European Union bilateral trade with Russia is greater than India's bilateral trade with Russia. And of course, I think everyone knows that China's purchase of Russian oil is greater than India's purchase of Russian oil. So why is then the United States going after India? Well, I think it's first important to note that this didn't even start under Donald Trump, because under his predecessor, Joe Biden, we saw the U.S. Department of Justice basically wage legal warfare against Gautam Adani. We saw also the Biden administration provide refuge to Khalistani terrorists. And we saw even there sort of, the first inkling of economic threats towards India. Now this hybrid economic warfare against India is going into turbo mode under the Trump administration, because as President Trump himself said, as his Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent has repeatedly said, for the United States, BRICS is the big problem, because they see in BRICS a potential financial economic coalition that can provide an alternative to the U.S.-led financial system. And if the U.S.-led financial system no longer has a monopoly on the global financial system, then that undercuts the very fabric of U.S. hegemony. And so, from Moscow's perspective, these attacks on India are not even about, trying to strong-arm Russia. They're about pursuing a divide-and-conquer strategy within BRICS. But I think to Russia's great relief, India has shown itself to be very resilient in the face of U.S. pressure, because obviously Washington was expecting that it would be easier to intimidate India rather than China, because India has long strived to preserve a good relationship with the United States, with other Western countries. But Prime Minister Modi is showing very clearly that India cannot be bullied around. And we, of course, attach great significance, symbolic significance, to the fact that Jaishankar is coming to Moscow, the fact that he is showing clearly that India will continue trading with Russia, India will continue strengthening its involvement in the multipolar world order. And I mean, I think that's, from Russia's perspective, an enormous sign of strength by India.
Yes, Dmitry, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with us and provide insight. Of course, these upcoming meetings, we will be following them and bringing you all of those updates as they happen, looking at relations between Russia and India, but also the wider ramifications amidst talks surrounding conflict and global trade. But let's now move to the Middle East, where Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz has approved a military plan to conquer Gaza City and authorised the call-up of 60,000 reservists. His ministry confirmed the decision today as ceasefire mediators awaited an Israeli response to their latest truce proposal. The plan, accepted by Hamas, calls for a 60-day pause in fighting, staggered hostage releases, Palestinian prisoner swaps and increased humanitarian aid. Mediators Qatar and Egypt say it nearly is identical to a version Israel had earlier agreed to, but officials in Jerusalem insist any deal must secure the release of all hostages. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has not commented directly, but last week vowed Israel would only accept an agreement on their conditions. Hamas, meanwhile, accused him, that being Benjamin Netanyahu, of risking another mischance for peace. On the ground, Gaza's civil defence has reported 48 deaths in fresh Israeli strikes, with residents calling flour white gold as aid remains scarce. Israel says its forces are working to dismantle Hamas and taking precautions to limit civilian harm. The war, now almost into its second year, has killed more than, into its third year, has killed more than 62,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza health officials. This alongside 1,219 people in Israel after Hamas's devastating October the 7th attack in 2023. Well, with us to discuss these latest developments, Peter Baum, a foreign editor of the Weekly Blitz, joining us live from London. Peter, as always, a pleasure to have you on the programme. Let's look at the significance of this approval. 60,000 reservists approved to be called up. Is this the moment where the whole of Gaza is taken over by Israel?
Potentially, yes. And this is the paradox. It's clear to me that the military strategists within the Netanyahu administration have won the day over the political strategists. I have no doubt about this. If Netanyahu actually does proceed with this plan to take over Gaza, his sole objective in doing this would be to completely annihilate whatever Hamas defense mechanisms they have left. Now, he's doing this in the knowledge that his borders are secure in the north, because Lebanon under Hezbollah are no longer a threat. The Lebanese army and the Lebanese government, with Trump's backing, are definitely seeing to that. We're witnessing that the Houthis very occasionally send a missile over, which has been intercepted, so their military threat has been diluted significantly. And Iran, because of the problems they're facing, as we've spoken about many times, with the water crisis, again, is no longer posing the threat. Hamas potentially could still pose the greatest threat to the Jewish state of Israel. And it's clear to me that the hawks within the government, the military strategists, have determined that the only way that Israel is going to secure an everlasting peace is by destroying Hamas. Now, Militarily, I'm sure that they can achieve that objective because Hamas has been severely weakened. But diplomatically, it could be an absolute disaster.
Yes, and Peter, building on that, of course, there's been further disputes and comments made between Israel and Australia, as well as Israel and France, that over a potential two-state solution and recognition of a Palestinian state. But of course, there has been condemnation from several world leaders about the situation in Gaza. How do you think this offensive, now approved and confirmed with 60,000 extra troops on the ground potentially, how will that be seen by world leaders who have already spoken out against this offensive?
Okay, well, Trump clearly has decided to back Netanyahu because the Trump administration, the voice that Netanyahu only listens to, has determined, I think from the comments Trump made, that there will only be peace, or the hostages, excuse me, will only be safe when Hamas is defeated. So it is with that support from the US administration that Netanyahu feels emboldened. I think with all the diplomatic faux pas that the Israeli government has suffered in the last, let's be realistic, six months to a year, this current administration is willing to see that out. They will take on the chin whatever Macron throws at him, whatever Australia throws at him, in the knowledge that Trump is still supporting Netanyahu. So diplomatically, as I say, it will only exacerbate the wrath of those current world leaders who are critical of Netanyahu and the way they've conducted the Gaza war. But whilst he's got the backing of Donald Trump, I think he feels emboldened and will proceed with the ultimate objective of completely destroying whatever Hamas's military capabilities are.
Peter, we've spoken in recent days about the protests in Israel calling for an end to the conflict and a hostage deal. A hostage deal in some form is on the table. It looks like Israel is going to reject that deal and continue with the war. How are Israeli protesters and the public in Israel going to react to this confirmation?
Okay, now this issue, the protests in Israel, if they continue in with the power that they have continued in numbers, then this again could be apart from Trump deciding that Netanyahu is taking the wrong approach, and there's no sign of that yet. Domestic politics, i.e. the number of people protesting about the way Netanyahu is conducting in the war, would be, the only other reason why the Gaza initiative, let's say, will stop. So it remains to be seen, and we'll know this probably within the next 48 hours, if the protests in Israel are such that Netanyahu determines that it could bring him down politically, domestically, and therefore he may, let's say, row back from the statements, because it's only a statement at the moment, although the reservists have put a notice, as you quite rightly say, 60,000 of them, but that has not yet been given the green light for the actual military operation. It could be all bluff, it could be all bluster. We don't know yet, but I'm pretty sure, and your question was a very valid one, if the domestic protests in Israel continue as they have been continuing the last days, this could be the very reason why Netanyahu goes back to the negotiating table.
Peter, just before we move on, I do want to circle back to humanity at this point where diplomacy, of course, is the key point of discussion. But as we know, an offensive in Gaza City will have a humanitarian impact. There are displacement orders that have been issued and will be issued as different areas see military action on the ground. But how do you expect pressure on Israel, besides from the US, to come in if there is further calls of humanitarian crisis and civilian loss of life as a result of this offensive? Is Benjamin Netanyahu here isolating Israel on the international stage once again, and what could be the repercussions?
Okay, now this is a very valid point, because clearly what we've seen has been an anti-Netanyahu consensus amongst the vast majority of nations within the UN. We've seen aid groups coming out virtually in unison, condemning the way Israel is conducting the humanitarian aid. However, and I put a caveat on all this, what is definitely clear is that aid via the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, is getting through. Aid also is getting through from various nations that have been supporting the GHF, although they are not giving public support, but behind the scenes they definitely are. There's been aid drops from many European nations, Cyprus, Germany, Spain, the UAE and Jordan as well. So I think Netanyahu perceives that he can wear this one through, he can back this off. There was clearly be negative publicity, whatever Israel does, she will always receive that. But I think Netanyahu's cabinet have taken the view that with the increasing aid getting through to the Gazans, and with this new initiative that I think I spoke to you about yesterday, this click and collect system that seems to be working in about 15 distribution points now. I think Netanyahu that will all be taken into consideration, but I think that will be of secondary importance to the military strategy that the hawks within his administration are trying to influence him to go with.
Peter, as always, such a pleasure to have you on the programme and have your insights. Of course, many discussions set to take place following this confirmation and approval, and we will bring all of those updates to you. Let's now move, though, to North America, and President Donald Trump has lashed out once again at Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, accusing him of hurting the housing industry by keeping interest rates high. Trump, in a Truth Social post, argued that the Fed's policies are making it difficult for people to secure mortgages despite a decline in inflation. He's once again calling for a large rate cut to help stimulate the economy. This feud between Trump and Powell has been ongoing. Trump has repeatedly criticised Powell for not doing enough to cut interest rates, especially after the pandemic-induced economic shocks. Trump's push for lower rates contrasts with the Fed's more cautious approach, citing inflation concerns and the need to keep the economy stable. As Powell prepares for his speech at the Jackson Hole Symposium this week, all eyes will be on whether he signals any change in direction, especially as inflation and the housing market remain key concerns for the Trump administration. While joining me, it is my colleague, anchor and correspondent Thomas Porteous, live from the newsroom. Thomas, can you give us a brief update on how we got here?
Yes, of course, Joshua. This is just merely a chapter in the ongoing saga between Donald Trump and FED Chair Jerome Powell, who was previously appointed by Donald Trump in 2018. The Fed is a semi-independent branch of government that, of course, controls the central bank. Now, this relationship between an FED chair and a president is unprecedented, particularly some of the language that is being thrown about, particularly by the US president. Donald Trump says that Jerome Powell needs to cut these interest rates, which Jerome Powell largely cites needs to stay high due to Donald Trump's imposed tariffs. He cites the housing market, problems for Americans getting houses.
Yes.
Jerome Powell still won't budge. He's been very vocal of Jerome Powell on his social media, Truth Social, calling him too late Powell. Trying to turn many Americans against him. Jerome Powell's term goes to the end of May 2026, where Donald Trump already has his nomination lined up. He's also been vocal about his ambition to fire Powell, trying to find these legal methods in doing so to the FED chair. This follows about 3 weeks ago, where Donald Trump actually visited the FED quarters in person, where the two had a public spat in front of cameras. Essentially what happened is there was a new building that was added on to the FED headquarters about 5 years ago. Donald Trump pulls out a letter out of his pocket citing this as overspending. There was quite an entertaining exchange there, and certainly not a traditional American political exchange. However, as we have said previously, this is an ongoing saga, open criticism, particularly from Trump's end, towards Jerome Powell, and we will see how this continues and see if Donald Trump will once again go against the norm and possibly move forward in trying to sack a semi-independent official of the US government.
Yes, absolutely, Thomas. Thank you ever so much for that insight. Of course, a big development there, and we wait to see how that spat between Trump and Powell plays out ahead of next year. But that is all that we have time for. We will continue to bring you more updates from across the world very soon. Thank you.